Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Focus on Fellowships, where we are discussing, yes, you guessed it, NIH fellowships. I'm Dr. Erica Boone, Director of NIH's Division of Biomedical Research Workforce. Previously, in our Focus on Fellowship series, we have discussed the goals of NIH fellowship programs and parts of the application. Today, we have a special treat because we're going to be discussing fellowship peer review processes. Today, we are joined by two guests. Joining us again today is Dr. Lestranne Maynard-Smith, and joining us for the first time is Dr. Wufang Li. Both of our guests are scientific review officers at NIH's Center for Scientific Review. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you for having us.
No problem. We have a lot to discuss today. But before we get started, can each of you share a little bit more about your experience with the fellowship process?
Sure. As I mentioned before, I was a prior fellowship SRO, Scientific Review Officer at CSR, but I've also been very much involved in the implementation and development of this new fellowship review process.
I'm a scientific review officer and the fellowship point person at Center for Scientific Review. Basically, I'm the go-to resource for other scientific review officers when they have questions about policies or best practices for fellowship review.
Well, thank you both very much for that bit of background information. But before we get started talking about the fellowship review process specifically, can you both talk a little bit more about the role of peer review at the NIH?
I can take that one. Every year, NIH receives tens of thousands of funding applications. In 2024, NIH reviewed more than 87,000 applications through more than 2,000 review meetings involving over 30,000 peer reviewers. It's peer review through the work of those thousands of volunteer reviewers that helps us to identify which applications are most scientifically meritorious.
I remember, and I'm old enough to remember, when back in the day, applications were submitted on paper and they would show us these videos and pictures with this room full of paper applications. It's a lot of work accepting applications, but can you guys please explain a little bit more about the peer review process for those who might not necessarily be as familiar?
Yes, I can answer that one also, Erica. Once you submit an application to NIH, it undergoes a series of checks and referrals before it's read by the peer reviewers. First, NIH verifies that the application package is complete and free of errors. Applications that are missing a critical component or fail other checks cannot be reviewed. If everything checks out, applications are referred to both the NIH Institute or Center for funding consideration and to an appropriate scientific review group where it will undergo initial review. At the NIH, we use a unique two-level peer review process. The first level takes place in the assigned scientific review group, which is sometimes called a study section, where reviewers will assess the scientific and technical merit of the application using the defined review criteria and assign an impact score. A major outcome from the first level of review is a summary statement, which Wufang will explain.
If an application was discussed during the panel meeting, the summary statement will include an SRO summary of that discussion as well as the written critiques and individual review criteria scores from 3 assigned reviewers. If an application was not discussed, the summary statement will only include the reviewers' critiques and their preliminary scores for each review criteria. The summary statement, or in other words, the outcome of the first level of review, will then go to the second level of review at the funding institutes or centers. There, the institute or center's advisory council will consider each application's impact score, the strengths and weaknesses identified by the reviewers, and the outcome of the discussion, as well as the Institute's research priorities to then recommend which applications to fund.
So that was a lot of information, Mufang. And given how important it is, can you say a bit more about the steps associated with the peer review process, as well as explain a bit more about how fellowship applications will be reviewed?
Sure. First level peer review takes place at the Center for Scientific Review, or CSR. There, a scientific review officer, or SRO, will organize the review of a set of applications by a review panel. We sometimes call it study section. Those study sections are made up of experts in the relevant research areas who have substantial mentoring experience and are well positioned to evaluate the training potential of the applications. Like Lestring said, they will assess applications based on the review criteria and considerations found in the funding opportunity that you apply to. Science will be evaluated in the context of its effectiveness as a training tool to enhance the candidate's potential for and commitment to a productive, independent research career in a health-related field. You can read about each of the fellowship study sections on the CSR website.
Thank you so much for that review. And I really like how you started off by explaining that the science that's described within the application is evaluated in context of its effectiveness as a training tool to enhance the candidate's potential for a productive research career, or whatever it is that they choose, or however it is that they choose to participate within the biomedical research workforce. So thank you so much for explaining that. Next, we want to shift to the review criteria for fellowships. Can you tell us more about what those fellowship criteria are?
Of course, 3 review criteria are considered in the fellowship review process. And the first one is candidates' preparedness and potential. Reviewers will discuss the candidate's preparedness for the proposed research training plan, considering the context of the candidate's training stage and also the opportunities that have been available to them. They will also assess whether the candidate has demonstrated qualities such as scientific understanding, creativity, curiosity, resourcefulness, and drive. Those are likely to contribute to our successful research training outcome. This assessment will be based on the candidates and the sponsor's statements, as well as the reference letters. And they will consider the candidate's potential to benefit from the fellowship research training plan and to transition to their next career stage. In other words, they will evaluate whether the candidate needs the proposed training. The second review criterion considers the research training plan. Reviewers are asked to assess the rigor and feasibility of the research training project and how it would contribute to the candidate's scientific development. To evaluate the goals of the overall research training plan and the extent to which the plan will facilitate the attainment of those goals. Whether the research training plan identifies areas of needed development and contains appropriate activities and milestones to address those needs. The sponsor's scientific environment, facilities, and resources will be evaluated under this criteria in the context of whether they are adequate and appropriate for the proposed research training plan. Finally, the third review criteria asks about the sponsor's commitment to the candidate. Reviewers will assess whether the sponsor's mentoring plan is strong and appropriate to meet the candidate's needs and goals, and whether the sponsor and institutional commitment is sufficient to allow for the successful completion of the proposed training plan and the achievement of the candidate's career goals. The extent of the commitment and the alignment with the candidate's research training plan will also be assessed.
Thank you for the explanation, and I can really appreciate how the review criteria have been realigned to really focus on the most important thing, and that is fulfilling the needs of the candidate to be able to successfully complete the current phase of their education and training and move forward to the next. So I really can appreciate that realignment of the review criteria score. But in the end, reviewers use the criteria to assign impact scores to the applications under review, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Erica. Reviewers will assign a numerical score between 1 and 9 for each of the scored review criteria, which generally serve as the basis for their overall impact score. But it's really important to point out that the final score is not a simple average of the criterion scores, and other factors can affect the final score. All the review factors reviewers consider can be found in the fellowship notice of funding opportunity to which you are applying. Candidates can read more about the scoring process on the NIH grants and funding site.
Thank you, Lestrand. But with those criteria in mind, how does the first level of review fit in context with that second level of review?
That's a great question, Erica. Like Mufang mentioned, the second level of review takes place at the Advisory Council for the awarding institute, center, or office.
So the Advisory Council, can you share a little bit more about what that is?
Absolutely. The Advisory Council is a body made up of scientists and public representatives chosen by the institute or center and approved by HHS to make recommendations about the institute or center's grant portfolio. It's the council that actually carries out the second level of review. The council will consider the full summary statements, not just the impact scores, for each application under consideration, as well as the institute or center's overall mission and research portfolios when recommending which applications to fund. And it's not the council that makes funding decisions. Funding decisions are ultimately made by the director of the funding institute or center.
So now I think everyone can understand why review in all of its steps can take several months. When can candidates expect to hear back about the status of their applications that they have submitted?
Yes, we get this question all the time. Summary statements are made available through ERA Commons about 30 days after the first level review meeting. If the application was scored well enough for discussion at the meeting, the SRO will also provide a summary of the review discussion.
You said scored well enough. What does that mean, scored well enough?
Well, just as I mentioned before, some applications will be discussed during the panel meeting and some will not. So review meetings generally discuss the top 50% of applications. If the preliminary score, overall impact score of your application is better than half of the applications in that study section, it has a good chance of being discussed. However, that's just an estimate, and the actual cutoff for discussion at a meeting will vary. But as I mentioned earlier, a summary statement will include the individual scores and comments from reviewers whether or not it was discussed.
And getting this information is super important for the fellowship candidate to consider whether their application is discussed or not. So once the candidate receives their summary statement, can you reiterate a bit more about who they should go to with questions or concerns about their application?
Sure. Generally speaking, after the review, a program officer at the funding institute to which your application has been assigned to will be your main point of contact. He or she may help interpret your review results and give you guidance in preparing for resubmission if needed. And that contact information of the program officer and scientific review officer assigned to your application can be found on the summary statement and in your ERA Commons account.
So I have a different question. What if a candidate has concerns about the fairness of their application's review?
Candidates can report concerns about peer review integrity to reportconcern@csr.nih.gov. Before we go, I'd like to add that your scientific review officer and program officer are here to help you. So please don't hesitate to reach out with questions about your application or the review process.
I always say to candidates that your program officer is your research best friend, but I'd like to amend that and now say that your scientific review officer as well as your program official are your research best friend. So thank you for those tips. Is there any other helpful information that you'd like to leave our viewers with?
I could jump in here. I think the most helpful advice is just to make sure that an application clearly and effectively meets each of the review criteria listed in the funding opportunity. Applications that clearly meet those criteria will be easier to review and generally receive better reviews.
This is excellent advice, and we know and understand that there's a ton of instruction that is involved in submitting an application, but we just want to really reiterate that it's very important that the candidate as well as their mentors and their institutional business officials really understand those instructions, because not only will it enable the candidate to be able to successfully submit their application, but it will probably make review of that application a lot easier as well. Lestran and Mufang, thank you so very much for joining us here today. I think that our viewers will really appreciate your insight into the fellowship review process.
Of course, great to be here again.
Thank you for having us again.
Thank you both again for joining us today, and thank you all out there for joining us on this latest episode of Focus on Fellowships. I hope that you will come away from this episode with a much better understanding of the NIH peer review process and are more confident in your next steps for applying for an NIH fellowship. For more information, make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn, on X, and YouTube for more news and advice on navigating the NIH application and peer review processes, and visit the CSR website for more information on peer review policies and processes. Join us next time for more about the sponsor's role in the fellowship application process. You all take care.